So moving into actual specific landscapes, don't worry about this particular panel on the slide thing. I have to rethink this. You have enough of the videos where you're actually going through places. You had the streets that you walked through earlier. So you've already done this. So don't worry about the landscape assignments page. What I want to go is the first of these, and Meining was very, very clear, and I think he's entirely accurate, that the first quintessentially American landscape, and by this from now on, we're just going to use that instead of the United States, was the New England village. You see towns like this in Canada, but they're not the dominant logic Canadian, but in the United States they are. And this becomes the first of these icons. It was an icon even during the colonial period that American towns, villages looked different than their British counterpart. So very quickly, let's do a segue in here, and we're going to use Google Earth to take a look at some of the, both an English standard and then look at sort of the quintessential American version of this. And I can't emphasize enough that Google Earth especially is just a tremendous resource to use when you're looking at built environment, because not only can you just pretty much go into any place, especially that has street view, which is a fair number of countries, but also what you get is when you're there, you can actually record, you can image these places, and you can actually save the images. And so you get a lot of enormous database that otherwise, you'd have to physically go to a place, you'd have to decide if it's the right place, et cetera, et cetera. So I just randomly picked a town. This is in, roughly the middle of England. It's a little town called Aston. I had no idea where, anything about it. I just randomly picked it. And again, one of the huge aspects that makes Google Earth such a tremendous resource is this. You take this little gold icon, and when you pull it over, you see everything's blue. The blue are the places that if you drop down to, you end up moving into street view. And what we've got is a quintessential English small town. I have no idea how old this place is. These places are quite recent. That's an English version of a subdivision, but these places are significantly older. I'd say at least the 19th century, if not older than that. Hard to tell. So this is a quintessential English town. I don't know where it is, but somewhere around here has got to be a pub. Because what you're going to find is at the crossroads like this, is traditionally there would be a drinking, eating establishment. Let's see. I don't actually see one here. If we spend a few minutes wandering through, we will find one. And again, some of these houses are relatively new, but some of them are actually older than they look. This has been remodeled, but this wall here is significantly old. And this is not a new wall. That type of dry stacking is pretty old. So what you see here is a quintessential English town. Notice it's very compact. There's a lot of sort of variable age, but a lot of this is older structures. And I can guarantee that in many cases, I have no idea where Aston is, but I can guarantee this particular road here has probably been in one that originally was a cow path or something like that. It's probably been there for hundreds of years. If we're in an area that had Roman influence, this road might actually be a remnant of a Roman pathway that goes back a couple of thousand years, or a pre-Roman Britain pathway. So what you've got is a huge amount of history attached here. And the sense of place then is very much a lot of these folks have been here for a really long time. And I can guarantee that if you went and Googled, if you could find anything about Aston, as well as some of it's relatively new, I can guarantee you there's stuff because that church is not new. So this is an old established community. People have been here for a long time. It has a great sense of place and a great sense of its own sort of position in the world around it. And the built environment reflects that. You've got a very traditional built environment. And the newer pieces go to some effort to at least vaguely look like they belong to this environment. So this is your quintessential British, sort of suburban, well, I should say alternate to suburban, which would be the small. Okay, we're now in Williamsburg, Virginia. And Williamsburg is a fascinating place simply because it's, on one hand, it is a historic town. On the other hand, it's an artifact of a historic town. Williamsburg is one of the colonial communities in Virginia. It pretty much had fallen on hard times in the late 19th century, and large parts of it were pretty much abandoned. This town itself had moved away from the original colonial period center. And what happens is, in the late 19th, early 20th century, there was this huge discussion as the form of migrants to the United States changed. The original idea of migrants to the United States, ironically, the statue, the Liberty statue, that whole, give me your weak, you're tired, you're poor, whatever it says on it, that was actually referring to Brits. And so the attitude of Americans was that the preferred form of migrant to the United States were British settlers. So the whole image is sort of the Mayflower Pilgrims, Calvinists, etc. You bring more Brits over. They might be odd Brits, like the Quakers moving to Pennsylvania, but they still were supposed to be Brits. Scottish were sort of okay. Irish were not okay. Irish were segregated in the United States right into the 1960s. So other types of English speakers were not right. But by the late 19th century, not only were we not getting Brits moving to the United States, if anything was going the other way, but what you had is more and more of your migration was occurring from parts of Europe where they were not English speakers, they're Italian, Polish, Armenian, all sorts of different groups that were not, from the standpoint of the folks that were already in the United States, were not the right type of people. We're not even getting to other groups. And so by the late 19th century, there was this fear in the United States. And again, this is very much sociobiological. So go back to the theory part, that the United States was losing its sense of American identity if you didn't get the right people to come in. In other words, they had to be pre-wired to be truly American, and that was going to have to be folks who were English speaking and British. And so there became this huge concern that you were losing that. So how were you going to re-educate or assimilate the new groups to remind them about what the real host culture was, i.e. the sort of Anglo-American? And so in doing so, one of the wealthy families at the time, the Rockefellers, which are still hugely wealthy, went and bought up large parts of Williamsburg and actually brought in buildings from all over New England and built a bunch of places, basically did an early version of Disney's Main Street and basically rebuilt Williamsburg in their late 19th, early 20th, first 20th century image of what colonial Williamsburg of, say, 1760 would have looked like. They then gifted it to the United States government and became a national monument, national park, or something like that. So it belongs to the United States government, but it was built by the Rockefellers. But so on one hand, when you look at this structure here, I can almost guarantee this structure was not here in 1750. And I can almost guarantee the structure was either not here at all, or was from somewhere else and moved here. So a lot of the structures in Williamsburg are actually from the 1800s, but they're not from Williamsburg. They were moved to Williamsburg to make a coherent, say, 20th century, say 1900 interpretation of what the colonial world looked like. Williamsburg is a hugely powerful image to Americans and hugely popular. It's one of the most trafficked of the national parks in the United States. And I'd say 99% of the people that see it think it's basically a time capsule of the past. Well, it is, but it's a time capsule of the past as envisioned in 1900 of the world of 1760. It's not a time capsule of 1760. So this is not what this place looked like, and these buildings weren't the way they were laid out back then. One of the quintessential things that's really interesting about Williamsburg is, in general, you see wherever possible, these are what are oftentimes called white picket fences. We'll get to that in a second. Which you very rarely see, this is one of the exceptions, is this, which was actually the American norm, which is called the split rail fence. But the key here for our purposes right now is notice how different this landscape looks than its British counterpart. This is a new landscape. These folks are coming out here, chasing off or wiping out the Native Americans, getting rid of the natural forest environments here, and basically ripping everything out and making their view of the world. It's still a very leafy green world. But among other things, you find the vast majority of building material is going to be wood. Why? Because you just got rid of a ton of trees and they're really cheap. And this is also Calvinist. And one of the classic ways you see Calvinists, because you have to remember the British aren't Calvinists. They got rid of the Calvinists. They sent them to Massachusetts. And so one of the aspects of Calvinism that makes a difference, if you think of the color of that British town, was largely, stone. Some stuff was stuccoed or whitewashed, but that's probably almost all recent. In reality, most of European architecture tends to be the natural building materials. That isn't true here. Trust me, when you cut up logs into timber, they aren't white. This whole area has been painted. And this part is actually accurate in the sense that no matter where the building's from, the Calvinists were fixated on the idea of white paint. And if you think about it, there's a very simple reason for that. Paved roads didn't exist until the 20th century, or 1860s, but at least in this part of America, didn't exist until the 20th century. Everything was gravel and dirt. What this means is during the summer is everything gets dusty. During the winter, everything gets muddy. And so if you think about it, what that means is this white picket fence, the top part might be sort of white, but everything from basically here on down is going to be brown. So for Calvinists, a white picket fence was a really good example of work. A picket fence is only white because you paint it. A picket fence only stays white because you go and you repaint it all the time, usually yearly. I think there's a part of Huckleberry Finn or one of the other Tom Sawyer stories where they're actually talking about the guys painting white fences. This becomes a quintessential part of America. So this is a very Calvinist landscape, and in that regard, it's a very different landscape from its British counterpart. Now, if you sort of flash forward, you think about that prefab home we saw, a couple of podcasts earlier. Notice how it takes pieces of these symbolic parts like these, which are actual functional light and ventilation features, and slaps them on a structure without that. In many cases, that place is almost an exact 21st century copy of a possibly 1900 copy of a 1750s house, which can get sort of dizzying when you think about it. So this is the first of mining's landscapes. The first mining landscape is the New England village, and the quintessential example or stereotype of the New England village is Williamsburg. So we get started. So we're going to take two podcasts to get through this. So first you have this idea of the village. In the New England sense, the village was a community, communitas in the classic sense. Now this is the same as its British counterpart because these folks are largely coming from initially the English Isles, British Isles. But the difference is that this is a shared religious community. And most of the folks here are going to be family members or related families. So again, this is the first part of J.B. Jackson's westward moving house is the New England village. Notice the extreme linearity. The New England, if you go back and go to Williamsburg, or I would strongly recommend, load up Google Earth and actually go and walk through parts of Williamsburg, you'll see the whole thing is gridded. The whole thing's rectangular. The reason is you don't have any history of those streets. The streets didn't exist for hundreds or thousands of years as Roman or Briton paths. They existed, when someone put in a house in 1720 and just basically put a line outside and said this is a street. So all this is brand new in 1750s terms. There's nothing here that gives you any indication of the Native American past, probably the Penobscots in this region, who lived in that possibly in the same exact area. I know there were some, I think it was Penobscots that lived in the area of Williamsburg. They get completely eradicated and removed from this area when Williamsburg is put in. So there's really no relationship to the past built environment, cultural landscape of the place, because that group's been entirely removed. They're replaced with this new group, which is basically European settlers. And European settlers who are almost entirely in one way, shape, or form Calvinist, who then make the world in this form. Now, since Calvinism is very big on structure, they're very, very big on linearity. So if you notice, everything in that image is very tidy and everything's very, very clean. This is actually a huge hassle for the Park Service because archaeologists and historians, invariably point out to them that they shouldn't have paved the streets, they shouldn't have gravelled them, because if it's really reflecting the 1750s, the place should be really dirty. But the modern stereotype of the New England village is tidy, clean, linear, and white. And so there's a very strong attitude that you have to have that. Otherwise, the visitors, the tourists that come to Williamsburg will be unhappy because Williamsburg doesn't fit their stereotype of the New England village. Because you have to remember, we're always looking at the past through the lenses of our stereotype of the past, not the reality of it. There's very little about Williamsburg that really is historically accurate. And that makes sense because a large part of the town isn't even from there. It's more recent constructs.